Outnumbered 4-1, the Lakota felt overwhelmed. They had less and less territory to live on. Red Cloud, a Lakota war leader, became enraged when the army built forts to protect the Bozeman Trail.
What has been done in my country, I do not want. The whites have surrounded me and left me nothing but an island. When we first had this land, we were strong. Now we are melting like snow on a hillside, while you are growing like spring grass.
Red Cloud's warriors and their Cheyenne allies determined to stop this invasion of their lands. Newspapers reported that only well-armed wagon trains could get through. In the middle of the fighting, a young farmer named Bill Thomas and his 7-year-old son set out for Montana.
August 3rd. About a half-a-mile drive from camp this morning is a grave containing the bodies of 5 men who were killed a few days ago by Indians. As I passed by the grave, I saw that the wolves had made an opening to the inmates and had torn the flesh from the bodies. Such is the depravity of man out here that he will hardly take time to pay his last respects to the dead, but leaves him for the wild beast to howl over and often feast upon.
Thomas and his son were found a week later on the banks of the Yellowstone River, arrows encircling their bodies, Thomas's journal lying beside him. In the winter of 1866, the Lakota and Cheyenne attacked the United States Army. Captain William Fetterman, who boasted he could defeat the entire Sioux nation with a single company, was ambushed and all 80 of his men killed. The decoys who had lured the soldiers to their deaths included a young Lakota warrior named Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse never allowed anyone to photograph him. The only likenesses of him are drawn in native ledger books. We know him entirely through stories.
Traditional history tells us that he can ride in front of a line of soldiers, and they can all take a pot shot at him, and no bullet will touch him. And he'd make 3 passes. And after the 3rd pass, then his followers are encouraged to make the charge. See, I haven't been wounded. I'm not shot. We will charge.
He was said to have been born near the sacred Bear Butte in the Black Hills. As a child, he was quiet and kept to himself. As a man, he would fight and come to be counted on by his people as a savior. After the Lakota closed the Bozeman Trail, 4 generals and a senator went west to negotiate. In the Laramie Treaty, the Lakota were conceded a large territory that included the sacred Black Hills. For a time, whites would stop traveling these northern plains, but the leader of the Peace Commission, General William Tecumseh Sherman, warned that this peace was only temporary.
The white men are increasing in numbers and power, and if they make up their minds, they will come to these plains as thick as grasshoppers, and they will kill you all. We, as your friends, want you to do what we know is best. Learn the white man's ways.
Thousands of people bypassed Lakota territory, taking the new railroads across the plains. The government granted millions of acres of free land to the railroads. Rail companies began huge ad campaigns to sell the land along their tracks. Whole towns from Europe were resettled on the plains by railroad agents. The Indian source of food was being wiped out. Passengers booked trips west to shoot buffalo, and buffalo tongues became a delicacy in eastern restaurants. William Cody, soon to appear on the New York stage as Buffalo Bill, was being paid $500 a month to supply buffalo meat to railroad crews. General Philip Sheridan, commander of the Western Army, wrote, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated, as it is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." The job of Sheridan's army was to control the increasingly angry tribes as the railroad settled immigrants throughout the West. In 1867, Sheridan summoned Custer to Kansas to defend railroad workers from mounting Indian attacks. Custer was an ardent believer in the United States' right to claim the West and that the Army was the advance column of manifest destiny.
Westward, the star of empire takes its way. Countless throngs of immigrants cross the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, selecting homes in the rich and fertile territories lying beyond. Each year, this tide of immigration advanced toward the setting sun, enlarging the limits of civilization. George Armstrong Custer.
Kansas was the first Indian campaign covered on location by the national press. As the Army unsuccessfully chased the Cheyenne, reporters found the long-haired, buck-skinned young Custer great copy. And whatever they missed, Custer supplemented with articles about himself, written under the pen name of Nomad. Charles Windolph served as a private in Custer's 7th Cavalry.
My father said that Custer was one of the meanest, arrogant, overbearing people he ever saw. He said he was all for Custer and for all the wonderful things that Custer thought he was going to do. He said that he didn't care anything about the men, or he said he didn't pay any attention even if we didn't have anything to eat. He said he'd still be riding at the head of the army, and he said with his blonde hair flying around. That's what my dad used to say.
5,000 soldiers, poor boys and immigrants looking for work, were sent west with little or no training. Many had never ridden a horse, and it was a rare cavalryman who was even a mediocre shot. They led dreary lives of harsh discipline and terrible food, with rations sometimes dating back to the Civil War. Alcoholism was common, desertion rampant, and suicide in some units approached 10%.
My dear father, I suppose you as well as mother will be very much astonished when I tell you that I have not been to Mass in 3 years, but it is the truth. I am afraid I'm getting to be a careless Catholic, but when a fellow is constantly roaming from one part of the country to the other, why, he grows careless in regards to religious matters. Some of the hardest cases that I ever came across are at present serving with this company, myself among the number. And as long as I do not get drunk or get into any disturbance, I am what is termed a good soldier.
In late November 1868, Custer attacked a Cheyenne village on the Washita River. Dividing his forces and striking quickly at dawn, they killed over 100 people, many of them women and children. Washita established Custer as a renowned Indian fighter, but it also caused some to question the Army's tactics.
There was absolute consensus on the end to be reached. That was the dispossession of the American Indian and their conversion to white Christian civilization. But there was no consensus whatsoever on the means to be employed to achieve this great conversion. The Army wanted to use force, but the humanitarians and most of the American people felt that there had to be a better way.
The government's solution now was to confine all Plains Indians to reservations. Once there, they became totally dependent on government agents who were often indifferent or corrupt.
The poor Indians are starving. We kill them if they attempt to hunt, and if they keep within the reservation, they starve. But Congress makes no provision, of course, and nothing is done. I wish Congress could be impeached. General William Tecumseh Sherman.
They're trying to tame us, our grandfathers. It's hard for them to do this because when you catch some kind of an animal, you want to tame it, but you're going to have a hard time to do this. Same way, same order. Much death, much serious, fearful deed happened in those early times.
A national cry to take Indian lands grew louder when the economy collapsed in the Panic of 1873. Desperate to avoid bankruptcy, railroad owners needed even more settlers to buy their lands. Speaking through the newspapers they controlled, they demanded that all Indians be removed.
The American people need the country the Indians now occupy, and many of our people are out of employment. The masses need some new excitement. An Indian war would do no harm, for it must come sooner or later.
The heart of Lakota and Cheyenne lands were their sacred Black Hills, Sapa. Though they had lived here for a little over a century, the Lakota had come to see the Black Hills as the place where they had entered the world, following the buffalo out onto the plains.
In the words of Red Cloud, he said, when a man is skin and bone, goes into the Black Hills, and comes out the next season, he's fat and slick and healthy. He said, that is my food store. That is a place where the Great Spirit has blessed, and that belongs to my people.
In 1874, the government took the first step in claiming the lands recognized as Lakota in the Laramie Treaty. Under the guise of a scientific survey, they sent Custer's 7th Cavalry into the Black Hills. There were over 1,000 men, over 100 wagons. A pack of reporters came along, as did President Grant's son, Fred, who was reportedly drunk for most of the expedition. Custer even had time to shoot grizzly bears with his favorite Indian scout, Bloody Knife.
To us troopers, it was a good deal like going on a prolonged picnic. We'd make great campfires, and almost every evening there'd be a band concert. General Custer was mighty proud of our 7th Regiment band, and they'd never failed to play the regiment's own song, Gary Owen. On the nights when the moon was out and the stars cracking in the sky, it was something to stretch out before a big, open log fire and listen to the music. Private Charles Windorf.
The expedition was a great success. Custer was front-page news. He had led his soldiers deep into rich and fertile territory where whites had never ventured before. And in the heart of the Black Hills, he had discovered gold. Within 1 year, 11,000 miners moved into the hills. By the next year, the number climbed to more than 25,000. The Lakota called Custer Chief of All Thieves and his trail the Thieves' Trail. But they moved north to avoid confrontation. It was said that Crazy Horse, grieving over the death of his only daughter from cholera, disappeared for weeks at a time into the hills. Each time, dozens of lone miners were found killed, an arrow in the ground by their bodies. President Grant's administration determined to buy the Black Hills, but the reservation chiefs would not agree on a price. Far from the reservation, a Lakota chief named Sitting Bull refused to negotiate. Disgusted, he proposed they get a scale and sell the earth by the pound.
The whites may get me at last, but I will have good times till then. You are fools to make yourselves slaves to a piece of fat bacon.
Sitting Bull and his band of Lakota, the Hunkpapas, defied all government edicts. Sitting Bull never signed a treaty. He thought the best way to deal with the Wasichus was to avoid them. He was known as an orator, a healer of the sick, and a visionary. He recounted in drawings his battles with native enemies and white soldiers. His people saw him as a symbol of resistance who would never be forced onto the reservations.
When I was a boy, the Lakota owned the world. The sun rose and set on their land. What treaty has the white man ever made with us they have kept? Not one.
Soon, Grant and Sheridan decided to end the Indian problem on the Great Plains once and for all. All Lakota and Cheyenne bands were ordered to report to the reservations by January 30th, 1876. The Army began immediate preparations to attack those who would not comply.
To the American of 1876, Indian wars were an anachronism, a reminder of a lost heroic age of American history. The Gilded Age New Yorker knew about Indians from reading dime novels or from watching Buffalo Bill or some other stage performer boot them around a Broadway stage. The idea that breech-clouded savages could stand in the way of progress or stand up to the U.S. cavalry would have struck most of them as absurd. This was a modern army with repeating rifles, artillery, and Gatling guns. There was no way that they could lose.
Custer wrote his brother Tom, "I think the 7th Cavalry may have its greatest campaign." He booked a speaking tour in anticipation of a triumphant return. In the early spring, something extraordinary happened. Large numbers of Lakota people began to leave the reservation. Fearing the Army's approach, they traveled toward Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse's camp in Montana, and their numbers grew to perhaps 10,000.
According to the stories that my grandparents told, they say it was the time when the people, meaning the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, all came together. They had a word for it. And that means they all came together.
The Army planned its biggest Indian campaign ever. They would march 3 separate columns into Montana. Custer's 7th Cavalry, 751 men, would ride with General Terry's Eastern Column. On the morning of May 17, 1876, the 7th Cavalry marched out of Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. As the band played "The Girl I Left Behind Me," and crying wives and children watched the soldiers ride by, a strange and unexplainable reflection of the Army column appeared above them in the clouds. 400 miles to the west, the huge Indian encampment was moving down the valley of the Rosebud River. Here, at the Deer Medicine Rocks, they held a Sundance, the annual gathering where people gave thanks, fulfilled vows, and sought visions. Sitting Bull fasted, cut 100 strips of flesh from his arms, then had a vision of soldiers dying.
Sitting Bull heard a voice from above saying, "I give you these because they have no ears." He looked up and saw soldiers on horseback coming down like grasshoppers, with their heads down and their hats falling off. They were falling right into our camp.
Soon after, scouts reported that soldiers were approaching from the south. Crazy Horse led 1,000 warriors in an all-day attack, forcing General Crook's column to retreat. Unaware of the defeat, the northern columns decided to send Custer's 7th Cavalry ahead. He was to locate the Indians, then wait for reinforcements. The last words of Custer's commander were, "Now, Custer, don't be greedy. Leave some for us."
We were in Indian country now. There were all kinds of signs that hundreds of Indians had been here. In one place we halted, there had been a Sundance lodge. The scalp of a white man was still hanging from the ridgepole. The old-timers told us young soldiers, if we were ever wounded and left behind, that we must save our last cartridge to blow out our own brains.
The 7th Cavalry had been trailing the Indians for a month. Riding with his 2 brothers and his closest friends, Custer was closing in. The trail turned towards the valley of the Little Bighorn River. Here, Custer made a fateful decision to pursue and attack, not wait for the other columns. He marched his exhausted troops long past midnight. Among those in the Lakota and Cheyenne camps, it was said that flocks of birds over the Little Bighorn that dawn darkened the sky. Some thought it was a warning. "20 miles to the east, Custer's Indian scouts were leading him through territory they knew well. Their people had been driven from this land by the Lakota. Now they were eager to see Custer defeat their old enemies.
My grandfather was called White Man Ransom, and he was one of the scouts serving directly under General Custer at the time.
Early in the morning of June 25th, White Man Ransom and the other Crow scouts climbed a high bluff. From there, they saw signs of an immense encampment in the distance and pointed it out to Custer.
And he pulled out his binoculars and looked around all over and shook his head, said, "No camp there. They're there." So he looked again. He still was not convinced that there was a camp there, but put his telescope back, said, "All right," said, "we'll go find out."
Repeating the tactics that had been successful at Washita, Custer divided his men into 3 groups. Major Marcus Reno, with just 174 men, was to cross the Little Bighorn and charge. Captain Frederick Bentine's command would skirt to the south to prevent any Indian escape. Custer and barely 200 soldiers would attack from the north. All were eventually to meet down in the valley.
They didn't know what they were going to get into when they come back up to meet Custer. They were supposed to meet Custer on the battlefield. And he was going to have all the glory. And it just didn't work that way. Just didn't come out that way.
Major Reno began his charge at the southern end of the village that stretched for miles along the river, hidden by the trees. One officer galloped ahead, calling out, 30 days furlough to the man who gets the first scalp.
My father was sitting down to breakfast on that morning, and his mother began to dish out they had a central pot from which they were fed. When I heard the sound of a running horse and a shouting, I couldn't make out what it was. And it came by inside the camp circle, and so my father was at that age where he was curious. He jumped up and ran out of the teepee. And it remained imprinted on his mind. A line of horsemen were coming along the ridge. And there was a slight breeze, and you could see a banner waving in. You could hear the sound of the rifle firing. You could hear the sound of, he said, like angry bees going around him. Some kind of plucked his shirt.
Reno's soldiers formed a skirmish line and fired into the village. Hundreds of warriors raced towards the attack. Terrified women and children ran for their lives. Sitting Bull, now too old to fight, prayed to the Great Spirit. Wooden Leg, a Cheyenne, joined those rushing to meet Reno's charge.
We could hear old men calling, "Soldiers are here, young men, go out and fight them." More and more of our people kept coming. Thousands of arrows were falling.
As the Lakota and Cheyenne pressed in, a shot hit Bloody Knife in the head, splattering his brains on Major Reno's face. Reno panicked. He led a disorganized retreat back across the river. The stragglers and wounded were clubbed from their horses. Others, not hearing any commands, were left behind. A third of Reno's men were now killed, wounded, or missing. Downriver, Custer was unaware of Reno's route.
One of the scouts, White Swan, and also another one by the name of Gozehead, took off their civilian clothes, started putting on their Indian battle dress and all. And they were singing their medicine songs or war songs, or sometimes called death songs. The scouts told Custer they would all die that day. My grandfather was one of Custer's scouts, and he taught me his war song.
Ignoring their warnings, Custer discharged his Indian scouts, but he needed more men to attack. He scrawled an order for reinforcements and sent it back to Benteen.
Benteen, come on. Big village, be quick. Bring packs. P.S. Bring packs.
Benteen's men were slowly making their way towards the village when the message reached them. They soon came upon the besieged remnants of Reno's command and went no further. Deploying his men over a long sloping ridge above the river, Custer waited for Benteen's reinforcements. The weary soldiers rested in the afternoon heat, their rifles in their laps. Hundreds of Indians, hidden by the tall grass, began to ford the river and creep towards the soldiers. Kate Bighead, a Cheyenne woman, was with them.
Most of the warriors left their ponies and hid themselves, creeping forward along coulees or behind small ridges. There were many hundreds of warriors crawling along the coulees, all around those soldiers.
Suddenly, hundreds of warriors sprang to their feet. A Cheyenne-led charge overran the nearby companies. As soldiers fell, all semblance of order collapsed. Crazy Horse led hundreds of Lakota and Cheyenne up the other side of the ridge. A Cheyenne warrior, Two Moons, fought at his side.
The whole valley was filled with smoke. We circled around them, swirling like water around a stone. It took about as long as it takes for a hungry man to eat his dinner.
My grandfather, who was 15 years old at the time, as he stood there and watched, he says it reminded him of like a whole flock of magpies swarming over a hill, going round and round.
Terrified soldiers ran towards Custer's position. Indian accounts described chasing them down like buffalo. On the top of the last hill, a small group of 50 men was overwhelmed. Under a rain of arrows, they were unable to stand or fire.
Warriors who had crept close to them began to call out that all of the white men were dead. All of us then jumped up and rushed forward.
As quickly as it had begun, the last stand was over. Custer and all 210 men under his direct command lay dead or dying on the battlefield. "4 miles to the south, Benteen and Reno's command was besieged on a high hill. They were being picked off by sniper fire. In the heat, the many wounded cried and begged for water.
The sun went down that night like a ball of fire. Pretty soon, the quick Montana twilight settled down on us, and then came the chill of the high plains. We felt terribly alone on that dangerous hilltop. Across the river and down below in the valley, we could see great fires and hear the steady rhythm of Indian tom-toms beating for their wild victory dances. And where was Custer? What had happened to him? Why had he abandoned us?
There was no dancing or celebrating in any of the camps that night. Too many people were in mourning. Too many Cheyenne and Sioux women had gashed their arms and legs to show their grief.
Fort Abraham Lincoln, June 25th, Elizabeth Custer. Our little group of saddened women, borne down with one common weight of anxiety, sought solace together in the old hymns. All were absorbed in the same thoughts. Indescribable yearning for the absent, an untold terror for their safety. At that very hour, the fears that our tortured minds had portrayed in imagination were realities, and the souls of those we thought upon were ascending to meet their Maker.
Hearing of the approach of the last Army column, thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho broke camp and dispersed into the mountains, leaving Reno and Benteen's command alive. The next day, the survivors came upon the remains of Custer's command. One officer, looking at the naked bodies scattered over the hillsides, exclaimed, "Oh, how white they look, how white." Captain Benteen called it a rout, a clear panic. After 2 days of 100-degree heat, the mutilated bodies of dead soldiers caused a horrible stench. Charles Windolph was assigned to burial duty.
And there was no time to be wasted, and he said all our friends, he said we had to just put them all in the graves, and he said that was the horrible part of it. And he said when we left, he said there was just nothing but all the graves. I don't think they even marked them in those days, did they? I don't think so. It was just the battlefield, and wherever they fell, and there was room, then they'd bury them.
Fearing the return of the Indian warriors, the burial crews left quickly. And dollar bills, the dead soldiers' pay, blew back and forth in the hot wind. News of the disaster soon broke across the country. Overnight, newspapers transformed the utter defeat into a vision of heroic martyrdom. Reporters who had never been within 1,000 miles of the Little Bighorn wrote of Custer making his gallant last stand. They singled out Sitting Bull as the fiendish agent of Custer's destruction, writing that he had learned Napoleonic war strategy from French Jesuits, or was not even an Indian, but a white renegade once expelled from West Point. A cry arose to avenge America's fallen hero. The Chicago Tribune wrote, "It is time to quit this Sunday school policy and exterminate every Indian who will not remain upon a reservation." The Army mobilized its entire western force against the Sioux and Cheyenne. Their rallying cry was, "Get the first scalp for Custer." Throughout the fall and winter, the Army pursued the scattered bands. Marching in sub-zero weather, the troops burned villages and supplies. The bands fled before them into the snows.
Before they left to go up in the hills, they saw the destruction of the camp. They saw the teepees go up in flames, and they heard the horses as their throats were cut. Well, all of the gathering of the summer's food they had just lost it. And there they were up in the mountains with had nothing to eat. And most of their equipment was left in the camp, and it went up in flames.
The army chased Sitting Bull's people north, keeping them from joining Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse's wife was sick with tuberculosis. His people were hungry and desperate.
Wherever we went, they came to kill us. Crazy Horse hardly ever stayed in camp. People would find him out alone in the cold. Once my father found him out alone like that, and he said to my father, "Out here, the spirits may help me. I am making plans for the good of the people." Black Elk.
One by one, the bands began to surrender. The following May, Sitting Bull crossed the border into Canada. He was hounded by reporters from New York looking for the real story of Custer's last battle. He told them, "They say I murdered Custer. It is a lie. He was a fool and rode to his death." The day after Sitting Bull escaped into Canada, Crazy Horse led 300 families into the Red Cloud Agency to surrender. Fearing trouble, the army eventually contrived to place Crazy Horse under arrest. When he tried to escape, a guard stabbed him in the back with a bayonet. Later that night, Crazy Horse died.
Over the years, people seek his last resting place, but no one knows. There were visitors to my father when I was still a young boy that told that those who had fled with his body and buried him took a blood oath. No one would ever tell his last resting place under pain of death. And no one has told.
Many people who fought alongside Crazy Horse lived to pass their stories on. But whites wrote the history. The Little Bighorn quickly became Custer's story. Within months, 4 plays about Custer were being staged in New York City alone. A 12 by 32-foot poster of Custer surrounded by hundreds of Indians, misdrawn with Zulu shields and Mohawk headdresses, was printed by the Anheuser-Busch Brewery and hung above the bar in most taverns and saloons in America. It was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, featuring The Last Stand as its dramatic climax, that brought Custer's legend to its widest audience. And Custer was killed thousands of times before thousands of people nightly across Europe and America. Even Custer's young widow went to see her husband's last stand.
Dear Mr. Cody, I always thank you from my heart for all that you have done to keep my husband's memory green. You have done so much to make him an idol among children and young people. Sincerely, Elizabeth Custer.
Elizabeth Custer outlived her husband by 57 years. Almost penniless in 1876, after all of Custer's bad investments, she wrote 3 bestsellers about her late husband that helped build his myth. When she finally passed away in 1933, she had fulfilled all his New York fantasies, living on Park Avenue and dying with a fortune of over $100,000. She had lived long enough to watch her husband recreated on film time and time again. Custer's last stand. Few images are as strongly etched in the American imagination. A century after his death, Custer is no longer a hero to a nation troubled by its treatment of native people. Yet our image of his last stand persists. Custer in his buckskins, with the flags, with his cavalrymen, the open range all around, and the Cheyenne and Lakota closing in. But for the Plains Indians who fought there, the memories were different. The fight with Custer was just one of many battles that led to the theft of their lands. Their own history told of warriors who died to defend their country. Through the hard years that followed, their stories and songs kept the history alive. And they still remember.
Crazy Horse, be courageous. The people still depend on you. You have only one life to live.
Major funding for this series is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.
Corporate funding for the American Experience is provided by Aetna. For more than 135 years, a part of the American Experience.
As an additional service of this station, Last Stand at Little Bighorn is available.